73 seconds. That was all it took to sever a man's livelihood. Vianney didn't yell when she fired Al Moore. She didn't have to. She simply slid the termination papers across the frosted glass table, the friction making a quiet, abrasive hiss. He didn't beg. He just stared at the heavy brass pen, his knuckles bruised-looking and pale-smelling faintly of stale coffee and exhausted defeat. She thought she was cutting dead weight. She didn't know she was signing a death warrant. Until she found the envelope. Morning in the executive suite of Nelson Industries did not begin with the sunrise. It began with the precise synthetic click of the climate control system engaging at exactly 6:30, flooding the air with a temperature of 68 degrees and the faint ozone metallic scent of filtered oxygen. Vianney Nelson thrived in this atmosphere. She was 38, unmarried by choice, and possessed a net worth that insulated her from the mundane frictions of human existence. Her world was a spreadsheet, and every person in it was a cell waiting to be formatted. At 8:14 on a Tuesday, the boardroom was a tableau of highly paid tension. 12 department heads sat around a table, carved from a single slab of reclaimed slate, their breathing shallow, their eyes darting anywhere but the head of the table. Vianney sat perfectly still. She wore a charcoal blazer that felt like armor, the wool blend stiff against her collarbone. She did not tap her pen. She did not sigh. She simply watched the digital clock on the far wall flip from 8:14 to 8:15. Almore Edwards was late. Again. This was his 4th infraction in 3 weeks. Almore was a mid-level logistics coordinator. He was 34, but his posture belonged to a man 2 decades older. He had always been unremarkable, a quiet worker who did his job without demanding praise, but recently his performance had fractured. Deadlines were missed, emails went unanswered, and he was consistently irritatingly tardy. At 8:17, the heavy oak door creaked open. The sound was a violation. Almore stepped into the room. He didn't burst in with frantic apologies. He merely slipped through the gap, his movements sluggish and heavy. His suit jacket was navy blue, but the fabric was tired, the lapel permanently creased from being slept in or carelessly tossed onto a chair. He smelled wrong for this room. Among the Tom Ford colognes and the crisp scent of dry-cleaned silk, Almore brought with him the odor of generic antibacterial soap, damp wool, and something fundamentally sour, the smell of a man running on fumes. "Mr. Edwards," Vianney said. Her voice was not loud. It never was. It possessed the low, resonant frequency of a cello string pulled too tight. Almore stopped mid-stride. He didn't look at her immediately. His eyes bloodshot, the skin beneath them bruised with heavy purple bags, focused first on the empty chair, then slowly dragged themselves to meet hers. "Ms. Nelson, I apologize. Traffic on the I-95 was—" "I am not interested in the I-95 door." Vianney interrupted, her tone flat. She unclasped her hands, feeling the cool air hit the faint sweat on her palms. She hated this part, not because she pitied them, but because it was inefficient. It wasted time. Traffic is a variable, Almore. Variables are meant to be accounted for. When they are consistently ignored, it implies a fundamental lack of respect for this company, this room, and my time. Almore swallowed. The sound was audible in the silent room. "It won't happen again." "You are absolutely correct," Vianney said. She reached for a manila folder resting squarely in the center of her blotter. "Because we are concluding our professional relationship today." A collective silent exhalation rippled through the 12 other executives. None of them looked at Almore. They stared at their tablets, complicit in their silence. Vianney opened the folder. The paper inside was thick, high stock meant to convey gravity. She slid it across the slate. It stopped precisely at the edge of the table nearest to him. HR has already processed your severance. 2 weeks' pay. Your health benefits will terminate at the end of the month. Please leave your keycard with security. She waited for the reaction. The reactions were always the same. Anger, bargaining tears. She had seen men twice her size weep openly, snot running into their mustaches. She had been called every name in the book. She was prepared to signal security with the button under the rim of the desk. But Almore did none of those things. He stepped forward. His breath hitched a wet, shallow sound that snagged in his throat, but his face remained a blank, terrifying mask of absolute defeat. He looked down at the paper. His hand hovered over it. Vianney noticed with a flash of irritation that his fingernails were bitten down to the quick, the cuticles raw and inflamed. He didn't sign it. He didn't pick up the pen. He merely reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his plastic keycard, and set it gently on top of the termination letter. The plastic clacked against the slate. "Thank you for the opportunity," Almore whispered. The words were completely devoid of sarcasm. They were hollow, like they were echoing out of an empty canyon. He turned and walked out. He didn't slam the door. It clicked shut behind him, sealing the sterile air back into the room. Vianney frowned. A bizarre cold sensation bloomed briefly in her stomach, like swallowing a piece of ice whole. It wasn't guilt. Guilt was an emotion for people who made mistakes, and she had simply optimized a failing system. It was dissonance. The equation hadn't balanced. People were supposed to fight for their survival. Almore had surrendered like a man stepping willingly off a ledge. "Let's move on to the Q3 projections," Vianney commanded, pushing the icy feeling down, burying it under the familiar, comforting weight of numbers. By 1 o'clock, the boardroom was empty. The lingering heat of 13 human bodies had been efficiently scrubbed away by the ventilation system. Vianney remained. She preferred the vast, silent space to her actual office. It was a place of command. She was reviewing a merger document on her tablet, the harsh blue light reflecting in her dark eyes. The coffee beside her had gone cold, a thin film of oil gathering on the black surface. She took a sip anyway, embracing the bitter acidic bite on her tongue. It kept her sharp. She stood to stretch her joints, popping quietly in the stillness. As she moved around the large slate table, her heel caught on something soft. She looked down. Beneath the chair where Almore Edwards had briefly stood, half hidden by the shadow of the heavy table leg, was a crumpled piece of paper. Not a corporate document. It wasn't on Nelson Industries' letterhead. It was a pale, sickening shade of salmon pink. Vianney sighed, a sharp hiss of annoyance escaping her lips. The cleaning crew wouldn't arrive for another 6 hours. She abhorred clutter. A single piece of trash in an otherwise pristine environment was like a dead pixel on a brand-new monitor, impossible to ignore. She bent down the fabric of her skirt, pulling tight, and snatched the paper from the carpet. It was thick, folded haphazardly, and felt slightly damp, as if it had been clutched tightly in a sweating palm for a very long time. She intended to drop it into the brushed steel wastebasket by the door, but as she unfolded it to ensure it wasn't sensitive intellectual property, her eyes caught a line of bold black text. St. Jude's Pediatric Oncology. Vianney stopped walking. The ambient hum of the building seemed to drop a decibel. Her eyes flicked down the page. It wasn't a letter. It was an invoice. It was heavily itemized, a brutal descending list of medical terminology that she didn't fully understand, though the associated costs were universally clear. Chemotherapy intravenous Cytoxan, $12,450. Radiation therapy localized, $8,200. Inpatient room and board, PICU, 14 days, $42,000. Surgical intervention, resection, $65,000. The list went on. Blood transfusions, anti-nausea medications, anesthesia. Each line item was a mechanical extraction of wealth, culminating in a total at the bottom of the page that made Vianney's breath catch painfully in her chest. Total balance. Due $348,912.45. Status final notice. Collections pending in the top right corner. Under the patient information it read, patient name, Lily Edwards, age 7. Guarantor, Allmore Edwards. Below the total, stamped in glaring aggressive red ink, were the words, coverage denied, out of network. Vianney stood frozen in the middle of the empty boardroom. The heavy paper felt suddenly radioactive in her hands. She stared at the numbers. $348,000. To Vianney, that amount was a line item on a quarterly tax write-off. It was the cost of a luxury sedan she would drive 3 times and forget in her garage. To a mid-level logistics coordinator making $65,000 a year, it was an avalanche. It was a suffocating, inescapable weight. Suddenly, the sensory memories of Allmore from 4 hours ago slammed into her with a violent clarity. The sour smell of a man sleeping in waiting room chairs, the bruised, exhausted eyes of someone watching monitors beep in a darkened hospital ward, the missing button on his shirt, the bitten fingernails. Traffic on the I-95 was... he hadn't been in traffic. She realized it with a sickening jolt of absolute certainty. He was at the hospital. He had been trying to leave a sick child to come to a job that paid him a fraction of what he owed, just to keep the health insurance that was denying his claims anyway. And she had taken it from him. Your health benefits will terminate at the end of the month. Vianney dropped the paper on the slate table. Her hands were shaking. She pressed her palms flat against the cold stone, trying to steady herself. It's not my problem, she whispered to the empty room. Her voice cracked, betraying her. It is a business. It is a business. She tried to summon the cold, pragmatic logic that had built her empire. If she kept underperforming employees out of pity, the company would collapse. The shareholders would revolt. It was the harsh truth of capitalism. You do not bleed for the cogs in the machine, because the machine will simply bleed you dry. But the logic felt thin. It felt like paper. It couldn't shield her from the memory of Allmore's hollow, deadened voice. Thank you for the opportunity. He wasn't thanking her. He was accepting his execution. Vianney grabbed the invoice, her grip crushing the edges. She shoved it into her blazer pocket, where it pressed against her ribs like a hot coal. She practically ran out of the boardroom, her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floors of the corridor. She needed air. She needed to escape the sudden, suffocating realization that her perfectly ordered universe was built on a foundation of profound, agonizing human misery. Vianney's Maybach S-Class was a sanctuary of acoustic isolation. When the heavy door thudded shut, it sealed out the sirens, the honking cabs, and the chaotic thrum of the city. The interior smelled of untouched Napa leather and the faint, citrusy tang of her own expensive perfume. Usually this silence calmed her. Today, it felt like a vacuum. She sat in the driver's seat, gripping the hand-stitched steering wheel. Her knuckles were white. The salmon-pink invoice sat in the passenger seat, mocking her. Drive to Nelson Plaza, she told the car's voice system. The engine purred to life, a vibration so subtle it was barely a sensation. She pulled out of the subterranean garage into the glaring afternoon light. She drove 2 blocks toward her luxury penthouse. Then she slammed on the brakes. The tires squealed a harsh, abrasive sound that made the driver behind her lean on his horn. Vianney ignored him. Her chest was tight, a frantic moth fluttering against her ribs. She couldn't go home. She couldn't sit in her glass box in the sky and drink a $200 bottle of Cabernet while Almore Edwards tried to explain to a 7-year-old girl why the nurses were looking at them with pity. "Cancel route," Vianney snapped. Her voice was raspy. "Navigate to St. Jude's Medical Center." The GPS chimed cheerfully, calculating the route to the city's eastern district, a part of town Vianney only saw from a helicopter. The drive took 45 minutes. With every mile, the scenery outside her tinted windows decayed. Glass-fronted boutiques gave way to pawn shops with barred windows. Artisanal coffee shops faded into peeling laundromats and liquor stores. The sky seemed to press down lower here, grey and oppressive. She pulled into the hospital's parking structure. It was a towering concrete monolith that smelled of old motor oil and stale urine. She parked the Maybach between a rusted sedan and a minivan, with a shattered tail light repaired with red tape. She felt profoundly out of place, an alien in a hostile environment. Stepping out of the car, the air was different. It was heavy, thick with exhaust and the humid, sour breath of the city. Vianney locked the car, the sharp chirp echoing loudly in the concrete cavern, and walked toward the entrance. The lobby of St. Jude's hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't the pristine, silent lobby of a private clinic. It was chaos. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an angry electrical frequency. The floor was scuffed linoleum sticky under her leather soles. The air smelled of industrial floor cleaner iodine, and the unmistakable metallic scent of blood and unwashed bodies. Everywhere she looked, there was suffering. A woman slumped in a plastic chair, sobbing quietly into a cell phone. An old man hacking wetly into a handkerchief. It was raw, unfiltered humanity, and Vianney felt a surge of nausea rising in her throat. She wanted to leave. Every instinct, honed by a lifetime of privilege, screamed at her to turn around, get back into her insulated car and drive away. She forced her feet to move. She approached the front desk, where a tired nurse in green scrubs was typing aggressively on an ancient keyboard. "Excuse me," Vianney said. Her voice sounded too loud, too crisp for this place. The nurse didn't look up immediately. When she did, her eyes swept over Vianney's tailored suit, her pristine blowout, and the Rolex on her wrist. The nurse's expression hardened into a flat, defensive mask. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for a patient. Lily Edwards, pediatric oncology." The nurse sighed, clicking a few keys. "Are you family?" "No." Vianney lied smoothly. "I'm her aunt, from out of state." The nurse eyed her skeptically, but pointed down a long, dreary corridor. "4th floor, west wing, room 412. But visiting hours for non-immediate family end in 20 minutes." "Thank you." Vianney walked toward the elevators. The doors opened with a sluggish groan, revealing a scratched interior that smelled strongly of rubbing alcohol. She pressed the button for the 4th floor. As she ascended, she felt a strange, cold sweat breaking out on the back of her neck. Why was she doing this? What was the objective? She had no plan. She didn't know what she was going to say. "I fired you, but I feel bad about it. So here I am." It was pathetic. It was arrogant. It was exactly the kind of hollow performative empathy she despised in her billionaire peers. The elevator dinged. The doors slid open to the pediatric oncology ward. The sensory shift was immediate. It was quieter here, but the silence was heavier, burdened by an unspoken grief. The walls were painted a cheerful pastel yellow that felt violently out of place against the reality of what happened in these rooms. Children's drawings were taped to the walls, stick figures with no hair standing next to smiling dogs. Vianney walked down the hall, her heels clicking softly. She tried to walk on the balls of her feet to mute the sound. She passed room 410, room 411. She stopped outside room 412. The door was ajar. Vianney pressed her back against the wall, holding her breath, and peered through the narrow crack. The room was dim, illuminated only by the harsh, pulsing glow of medical monitors and a small, weak reading lamp. In the center of the room was a bed that looked entirely too large for the tiny figure occupying it. Lily Edwards was asleep. She was impossibly fragile, her skin translucent, mapping a delicate web of blue veins across her temples. A colorful knitted cap covered her bald head. Tubes snaked from her arms, connecting her to bags of clear and amber fluids that dripped with agonizing slowness. And beside the bed, sitting in a cheap vinyl recliner that looked like it had been designed for maximum discomfort, was Allmore. He had taken off his suit jacket. His dress shirt was wrinkled, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms resting heavily on his knees. His head was bowed, buried in his hands. Vianney stood frozen, unable to look away. She watched as Allmore slowly lowered his hands. His face was bathed in the blue light of the heart monitor. He looked utterly destroyed. The stoic blank mask he had worn in the boardroom was gone. In its place was a man actively drowning. He reached out his large, trembling hand, gently grasping Lily's tiny tube-tethered fingers. He didn't say anything. He didn't cry. He just held her hand, staring at her chest as it rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths. In the quiet of the hospital room, Vianney heard a sound that finally shattered the ice around her heart. It was a low, ragged sound that Allmore made in the back of his throat, a suppressed sob choked back out of a desperate need to not wake his daughter, but born of a despair so deep it was physical. Vianney pulled back from the door, pressing her spine against the corridor wall. Her chest heaved. The smell of the hospital, the humming of the machines, the image of that tiny girl and the broken man she had ruined it all crashed down on her. She clutched her tailored blazer, feeling the sharp rectangular outline of the invoice in her pocket. She had fired him for being 14 minutes late. 14 minutes. For the first time in 20 years, Vianney Nelson didn't know what to do. Footsteps approached from inside the room. The squeak of rubber-soled shoes on the linoleum grew louder. Vianney pushed herself off the wall, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She needed to walk away. She needed to turn down the corridor, get back in the elevator, and vanish into the sanitized bubble of her life. But her legs refused to cooperate. They felt heavy, rooted to the scuffed floor tiles. The door to room 412 opened wider. Allmore stepped out into the hallway. He held an empty plastic cup, likely heading to the nurse's station for water, or the terrible drip coffee that sat in a charred pot by the waiting area. He didn't look up immediately. He was rubbing the bridge of his nose, dragging his fingers down his face in a gesture of profound exhaustion. When he finally opened his eyes, he stopped dead. The plastic cup slipped from his fingers. It hit the floor with a hollow, echoing clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet corridor, rolling in a lazy semicircle until it bumped against the toe of Vianney's designer heel. They stared at each other. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Vianney saw the exact moment recognition pierced through his fatigue. It wasn't a sudden cinematic realization. It was a slow, agonizing crawl of comprehension. His bloodshot eyes widened fractionally. The slack posture of a grieving father instantly rigidified into the defensive stance of a subordinate cornered by a predator. "Ms. Nelson," Allmore rasped. His voice was entirely stripped of moisture, scratching against his vocal cords. He looked wildly up and down the hallway, as if expecting a team of corporate lawyers to step out from behind the medication carts. What are you doing here?" Vianney swallowed. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. She opened her mouth, but the razor-sharp vocabulary she utilized to dissect board members abandoned her. She felt absurd in her structured charcoal blazer, a creature of high finance, entirely out of its depth in this corridor of lingering death. "Allmore?" She managed her voice, lacking its usual low resonance. It sounded thin, reedy. He took a step back, angling his body to block the doorway to room 412, a purely instinctual maneuver to shield his daughter. "Did I forget to sign something?" he asked, his tone laced with a sudden brittle panic. "The keycard, I left it on the table. The Severance HR said I had 48 hours to review the non-compete. If you need it now, I can—" "I don't care about the non-compete." Vianney interrupted the words, tumbling out faster than she intended. She reached into her blazer pocket. Her fingers brushed against the thick, damp paper. She pulled it out. The salmon-pink invoice looked garish under the flickering fluorescent lights. Almore's eyes dropped to the paper. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him the shade of wet ash. "You left this," Vianney said softly. She held it out to him. It wasn't an olive branch. It felt like a confession. Under the table, in the boardroom, Almore stared at the invoice, then at Vianney. A complex, rapid-fire sequence of emotions violently rearranged his features. Confusion morphed into mortification, which quickly solidified into a rigid, defensive anger. He snatched the paper from her hand, his bitten fingernails scraping against her palm. He didn't fold it. He crushed it into a tight, irregular ball in his fist. "You went through my things," he said. The deadened, hollow tone from the boardroom was gone. This voice vibrated with a low, dangerous heat. It was on the floor. Vianney countered her own defensive instincts, flaring automatically. She hated being accused. "I picked it up to throw it away. I saw the heading, so you tracked me down." Allmore stepped closer. He was taller than she was, and the proximity brought a wave of his scent, stale sweat, cheap coffee, and the terrifying metallic tang of fear. "To do what gloat verify that the man you fired is actually drowning, or did you come to give me corporate advice on how to optimize my bankruptcy?" "No." Vianney snapped, recoiling slightly. "Of course not. I came because—" She trailed off. Because why? Because she felt guilty. Admitting that felt like peeling off a layer of her own skin. "Because you wanted to clear your conscience." Almore finished for her, his lip curling into a bitter, humorless sneer. He leaned in his voice, dropping to a harsh whisper. "You saw a sick kid's hospital bill, and you realized that terminating my health insurance today means my daughter might not get her next round of radiation. And that made you feel bad. For about 5 minutes." Vianney flinched. The words hit her with the precision of a scalpel. "I didn't know," she whispered. It was a pathetic defense, and she knew it. "It wouldn't have mattered." Allmore shot back, his eyes blazing with a wet, feral intensity. "You don't care about the variables, Miss Nelson. That's what you said. Traffic cancer bankruptcy. They're just variables to you. I was 14 minutes late. You made the optimized choice." He turned his back on her, his shoulders heaving with a sudden suppressed tremor. He grabbed the door handle to room 412. "Allmore, wait," Vianney said, stepping forward, reaching out a hand, but stopping inches from his back. He didn't look at her. "Leave, Miss Nelson. You've done your job. Let me do mine." He pushed the door open, slipping inside, and letting it click shut, effectively locking her out. Vianney stood alone in the hallway. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, a mocking electric insect. She looked down at her hand, still hovering in the empty space where Almore had been. Her perfectly manicured fingers were shaking. She had expected him to beg for his job back. She had expected to offer a generous, tax-deductible donation, receive his tearful gratitude, and return to her Maybach with a restored equilibrium. Instead, he had held up a mirror to her, and the reflection, she saw was utterly monstrous. Level B2 of St. Jude's smelled aggressively of ozone-warm dust and toner ink. It was the administrative heart of the hospital, a subterranean warren of cubicles entirely divorced from the clinical life-and-death struggles occurring 4 floors above. Vianney navigated the maze of grey partitions with the predatory focus of a shark in shallow water. The humiliation of her encounter with Allmore had burned away, leaving behind a cold, intensely compressed rage. She was angry at Allmore for rejecting her unspoken apology, angry at herself for seeking it, but mostly she was furious at the system that had generated that pink piece of paper. She found a frosted glass door marked Patient Financial Services. She didn't knock. She pushed it open, the heavy door slamming against a rubber stopper with a violent thud. Behind the counter sat a man in a rumpled short-sleeve shirt. A plastic name tag identified him as Dennis. He was eating a sad-looking egg salad sandwich and staring blankly at a spreadsheet on a dual-monitor setup. He jumped as the door hit the stopper, dropping half his sandwich onto a stack of files. "Can I help you?" he asked, scrambling to wipe mayonnaise off a manila folder. Vianney marched up to the counter. She placed both hands flat on the scratched laminate surface, leaning in. Her charcoal blazer fell perfectly, throwing sharp, intimidating shadows. "I need to settle a patient account," Vianney said. Her voice was back, that low cello string hum that brokered millions and ended careers. In full, immediately. Dennis blinked, clearly thrown by her intensity. He wiped his hands on a napkin, adopting the defensive bureaucratic posture of someone used to dealing with crying, angry families. "Okay, Ma'am. Do you have the account number or the patient's name?" "Lily Edwards," Vianney stated. "Guarantor is Allmore Edwards." Dennis tapped his keyboard, the mechanical clack-clack sounding loud in the stuffy room. He frowned at the screen. "Edwards? Yes. Ah, I see." He looked up, his expression shifting from annoyed to patronizing. "Ma'am, this account is in final notice. It's currently being prepped for transfer to external collections. The balance is quite substantial. The insurance provider denied the inpatient coverage, citing out-of-network. I don't need a recitation of the bureaucratic failures." Vianney snapped, her eyes narrowing. "I need the exact total." Dennis bristled, puffing his chest out slightly. "Are you the guarantor? Because due to HIPAA regulations, I can't discuss the itemized charges unless you are listed as an authorized party, or if Allmore Edwards is present to consent." "I am not asking for her medical history," Vianney said, spacing her words out with deliberate freezing precision. "I am not asking for an itemized receipt. I am asking you to tell me the number required to make this account read 0. Taking my money does not violate HIPAA, Dennis." Dennis opened his mouth, closed it, and looked back at his screen. He highlighted a cell. "The current outstanding balance, including late fees and the recent surgical suite charge, is $348,912.45. He looked back at her, a hint of smugness in his eyes, expecting her to gasp, to cry, to ask for a payment plan. Vianney didn't blink. She reached into her blazer, produced a heavy matte black American Express Centurion card, and slapped it down onto the laminate counter. It landed with a dull, heavy clink. "Run it," she commanded. Dennis stared at the card. He recognized it. Everyone in finance recognized the black card. He looked from the card to Vianney, his smugness evaporating into nervous confusion. "Ma'am, this is a very large transaction," he stammered, picking up the card as if it were a live grenade. "The merchant fee alone. Our system might flag this. Usually balances like this are handled via wire transfer or cashier's check." "Your system will not flag it," Vianney replied coldly. "Run the card, Dennis." He swallowed hard, swiped the heavy metal card through the reader attached to his keyboard, and began typing the astronomical figure into his terminal. His fingers trembled slightly. The machine chirped, processing. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the room was the hum of the air vents and the distant rumble of the subway vibrating through the concrete floor. Vianney stared at the screen, her jaw locked. She was buying her way out. It was the only mechanism she knew. Throw enough capital at a structural flaw, and the problem vanishes. The terminal chimed a high, cheerful note. A long receipt began to spool out of a small printer next to Dennis's monitor. He stared at it in stunned silence, then tore it off, handing it across the counter, along with her card. It went through, Dennis whispered. The account is settled. 0 balance. Vianney took the card and the receipt. She looked at the piece of thermal paper. Total paid $348,912.45. Balance $0. It was just numbers. Pixels on a screen traded for ink on paper. She turned and walked out of the office, ignoring Dennis's belated, "Have a nice day, Mom." She walked back to the elevators, pressing the up button. The doors opened, and she stepped inside the metallic walls, reflecting her rigid posture. She held the receipt in her hand, waiting for the relief to wash over her. She waited for the ledger in her soul to balance. She had fixed it. She had erased the crushing debt that had brought a man to his knees. But as the elevator ascended toward the lobby, the cold weight in her stomach refused to dissolve. Fixing the debt didn't cure the cancer. Paying the bill didn't undo the look of utter devastation in Allmore's eyes when she had slid the termination papers across the slate table. She had removed the financial symptom, but she was still the architect of his immediate ruin. She stepped out into the chaotic lobby, the smell of iodine and floor cleaner rushing back into her lungs. She stopped near a row of plastic waiting chairs, clutching the receipt. For the first time in her meticulously calculated life, Vianney realized that some variables could not be balanced with a checkbook. She had bought his debt, but she still owed him his dignity, and she had absolutely no idea how to pay for that. Waiting was a skill Vianney Nelson did not possess. Her entire existence was engineered to eliminate idle time, yet she found herself sitting in the basement cafeteria of St. Jude's, pinned to a molded plastic chair that aggressively dug into her lower back. The cafeteria at 4:40 in the afternoon was a depressing liminal space. It smelled of boiled broccoli, old fryer grease, and the sharp industrial tang of chlorine bleach. The fluorescent lights overhead emitted a persistent, high-pitched whine that drilled directly into the space behind her eyes. In front of her sat a styrofoam cup of black coffee she had purchased solely to justify occupying the table. She had taken one sip. It tasted of burnt copper and stale water, coating her tongue in an acrid film. She had been sitting there for an hour. She could not go back up to the 4th floor. Invading Allmore's space while he sat vigil beside his unconscious daughter felt like a violation she could not stomach. So she waited. She calculated that human biology would eventually force him downward. He would need food or caffeine, or simply a space where the air wasn't saturated with the sounds of dying children. Her phone buzzed in her blazer pocket. A furious vibration. Her executive assistant, her general counsel, the board. She ignored them all, staring at the thermal paper receipt folded neatly beside the styrofoam cup. At 5:12, Allmore walked in. He moved with the stiff, mechanical gait of a man navigating underwater. His navy suit jacket was gone. The white dress shirt he wore was untucked on one side, the collar unbuttoned, revealing a pale, exhausted throat. There was a faded brown coffee stain near his left cuff. Vianney watched him bypass the hot food counter entirely. He went straight to a row of illuminated vending machines in the far corner. He dug his hand into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $1 bill. He tried to feed it into the slot. The machine whirred, chewed on the paper for a second, and aggressively spat it back out. Almore sighed a heavy deflation of his shoulders. He smoothed the bill against the edge of the machine, flattening the corners with his thumb, and tried again. The machine rejected it a second time. Vianney watched his hand clench. He didn't yell. He didn't kick the glass. He just leaned his forehead against the cool, thick plexiglass of the machine, his eyes squeezed shut. It was a terrifyingly quiet surrender. The mundane cruelty of a broken dollar bill was simply the final insurmountable obstacle in a day that had systematically dismantled his life. Vianney stood up. Her legs were stiff, her charcoal skirt wrinkled at the creases, but she ignored the discomfort. She walked across the sticky linoleum, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic cadence that cut through the low hum of the refrigerators. Almore didn't hear her until she was standing right beside him. She didn't speak. She reached out her pale, manicured hand, passing his arm, and tapped her American Express card against the contactless reader on the machine. The digital display blinked from a red "Insert Cash" to a green "Approved." Almore snapped his head up, jerking away from the machine as if it had shocked him. He saw her, and the raw exhaustion on his face instantly hardened into a mask of brittle hostility. "I told you to leave," he said. His voice was a rasp, completely devoid of energy. "Did you really wait down here to buy me a bag of stale pretzels, Miss Nelson? Is that the grand gesture?" Vianney withdrew her hand. The air between them felt dangerously thin. "Pick what you want, Almore. I don't want anything from you. You need calories. You look like you are going to pass out, and your daughter does not need you collapsing on the floor of her room. Press a button." He glared at her, his jaw working as he ground his teeth together. The stubborn pride radiating from him was palpable, a physical barrier he was erecting to survive her presence. But biology won. He punched a button, a coiled wire spun, and a plastic-wrapped sandwich dropped into the tray with a sad thud. He bent down, retrieved it, and stood back up. He didn't say thank you. "Now," Almore said, clutching the sandwich in his fist, the plastic crinkling sharply. "What do you actually want? Because people like you don't hang around hospital basements unless they want a return on their investment." "Sit down with me," Vianney said. "No. Almore, please." The word tasted completely foreign in her mouth. She couldn't remember the last time she had genuinely pleaded with anyone. Almore stopped. He looked at her closely. Really looked at her for the first time since she had handed him his termination papers. He seemed to register the tight, unnatural set of her shoulders the way she was clutching her leather purse like a shield. He gave a sharp, humorless exhale through his nose. 2 minutes. Then I am going back to my kid." They sat at a small round table near the wall. The laminate surface was tacky to the touch. Almore didn't open his sandwich. He placed it squarely between them, folded his arms across his chest, and waited. His hostility wasn't hot. It was a cold, absolute zero defense mechanism. Vianney reached into her pocket. She brought out the folded thermal receipt. She placed it on the table and slid it across the sticky surface until it bumped against the plastic wrapper of his sandwich. "What is this?" Almore asked, not moving his hands. "Read it." He stared at her for a long moment, a muscle ticking in his jaw, before unfolding his arms. He picked up the paper. It was curled at the edges, cheap material that would fade in a month. Vianney watched his eyes track across the black ink. She saw the exact millisecond his brain registered the numbers. First his brow furrowed in deep confusion. His eyes darted to the top of the receipt, reading the hospital's header, then back down to the line item. Total paid $348,912.45. Then to the final line. Balance $0. His breathing stopped. The silence at the table stretched so tight, Vianney felt it might snap and take her head off. Almore's hands began to shake. It started as a fine tremor in his fingers and rapidly spread up his wrists, rattling the thin thermal paper. He dropped the receipt onto the table as if it were coated in acid. "Is this a joke?" he whispered. His voice cracked violently. "No," Vianney said evenly. "The account is settled." Almore stared at the paper, then up at her. The hostility in his eyes fractured, replaced by a terrified, desperate panic. "Why?" The word was dragged out of him. "Why would you do this? You fired me this morning. You took away my insurance. Now you— What is this? Some kind of sick tax write-off. A publicity stunt. There is no press here, Almore." Vianney replied, her voice maintaining a forced level calm, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "My PR team doesn't know where I am. No one knows. Then what is the catch?" Almore's voice spiked, drawing a dirty look from a janitor mopping near the exits. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "What do you want from me? You want me to sign a non-disclosure. You want to buy my silence because you realized terminating a guy whose kid has leukemia looks bad on a spreadsheet. I don't have anything left to give you. You already took my job. I am giving it back." Almore froze. He blinked, the frantic energy suddenly short-circuiting. "What?" "I am voiding your termination," Vianney said, leaning slightly forward, meeting his bloodshot eyes. "HR will receive an internal memo stating that there was a clerical error regarding your employment status. Your health insurance remains active. It will not lapse. Not today, not at the end of the month." Almore stared at her. He looked completely unmoored. The ground he had been preparing to brace against had just dissolved. "You can't just unfire someone. That's not how it works. I own the company, Almore. That is exactly how it works." He looked down at the receipt, then back at her. The internal contradiction tearing through him was agonizing to witness. He wanted to reject her. He wanted to throw the receipt in her face and retain his dignity. But he was a father, and the piece of paper on the table was the difference between his daughter's life and a financial abyss. "I don't understand," he choked out, rubbing the heels of his hands aggressively into his eyes. "You sat in that boardroom. You looked right through me. You told me traffic was a variable." "I was wrong," Vianney said. The words felt like swallowing ground glass. She forced herself not to look away, forcing herself to endure the weight of his stare. "I operate a system built on efficiency." Vianney continued, her voice, low trembling slightly despite her rigid control. "If a piece of the machine malfunctions, I remove it. I don't look at why it stopped working. I just replace it. It keeps the structure sound. But today I saw what that efficiency actually costs." She gestured to the receipt. "I am not a good person, Almore. I am not a savior. I paid that bill because when I saw it under the table, I realized I had condemned a dying child to save 14 minutes of corporate time. I paid it because the guilt made me physically ill." Almore dropped his hands from his face. His eyes were wet, swimming in unshed tears, but he was holding them back with a desperate, agonizing force. "You don't owe me gratitude," Vianney said, quickly needing to cut off the vulnerability before it drowned them both. "You don't owe me extra hours. You are reinstated as a logistics coordinator. You will work remotely. If you need to be offline for doctor's rounds, you will flag it in the system and log off. We will assign a secondary associate to cover your blind spots." Almore's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The defensive walls he had built to survive the day finally catastrophically collapsed. He leaned his elbows on the table and buried his face in his hands. He began to cry. It wasn't polite, It wasn't cinematic. It was a raw, ugly, suffocating release of terror and relief. His shoulders heaved, shaking the small table. He dragged in wet, stuttering breaths, unable to formulate words, just making low, choked sounds of pure exhaustion. Vianney sat frozen. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to pat his shoulder awkwardly and walk away. She was entirely unequipped to handle human grief at this proximity. It was messy. It smelled like sweat and old coffee. But she didn't leave. She sat back in her rigid plastic chair, keeping her hands folded in her lap. She let him weep in the middle of the grimy cafeteria. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him everything was going to be okay, because she had no idea if it would be. Lily still had cancer. Allmore was still entirely broken. She simply anchored the space, letting the silence hold the weight of the man she had almost destroyed, and the absolute mess she had just made by trying to save him. 72 hours later, the boardroom on the 41st floor of Nelson Industries felt fundamentally altered to Vianney. The temperature was still a perfectly regulated 68 degrees. The ozone scent of the HVAC system still pumped relentlessly through the hidden vents, but the reclaimed slate table no longer felt like an altar of efficiency. It felt cold, heavy, and uncomfortably vast. It was a Thursday morning. 10 department heads were present. Vianney sat at the head of the table, her posture impeccably straight, clad in a stiff navy blue sheath dress. She was currently listening to Gregory, the senior vice president of operations, dissect the third quarter logistics bottlenecks. Gregory was a man who smelled aggressively of peppermint mouthwash and starched cotton. He had a habit of tapping his Mont Blanc pen against his leather folio when he was annoyed. He was tapping it now. "The primary issue in the Northeast Corridor," Gregory said, swiping a finger across his tablet to project a line graph onto the frosted glass wall, "is the delayed routing approvals. Edwards's queue is backing up. We are seeing a 24-hour lag on vendor confirmations." Gregory paused, his eyes flicking toward Vianney. "I reviewed the HR file, Vianney. Edwards was processed for termination on Tuesday. Then a reversal memo was issued Wednesday morning, citing a clerical error, along with a mandate for indefinite remote work and flexible hours. I don't mean to overstep, but logistics is not a flexible department. The supply chain does not pause. If the man is failing to meet his metrics, reinstating him is a structural liability." The room went entirely still. The other executives kept their eyes glued to their tablets, avoiding the crossfire. Vianney stared at the line graph on the glass wall. 3 days ago, she would have agreed with Gregory completely. She would have praised his ruthless attention to the data and signed off on finding a replacement within the hour. Instead, a phantom smell ghosted through her sinuses, the sharp metallic tang of an oncology ward, mixed with the stale sweat of a terrified father. The structural liability, Gregory Vianney, said, her voice dropping to that low resonant frequency that made people instinctively hold their breath, is our lack of redundancy. Why does a 24-hour lag in one mid-level coordinator's queue create a bottleneck for the entire Northeast Corridor? Gregory blinked his pen, halting mid-tap. "Well, Allmore is the primary point of contact for—" "Then reassign a secondary," Vianney interrupted, cutting him off with surgical precision. "Draft one of the junior analysts to shadow his queue. If an approval sits for more than 4 hours, the analyst clears it. Allmore Edwards' employment status is no longer up for debate. Fix the routing protocol, not the personnel." Gregory's jaw tightened. Vianney, with respect, paying 2 people to do the job of 1 is entirely inefficient. "It is," Vianney agreed flatly. "It is a highly inefficient temporary patch. Implement it by noon." She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't tell them about St. Jude's, or the pink invoice, or the vending machine in the basement. She simply let the directive hang in the sterile air an unmovable object. Gregory swallowed his objection, nodded stiffly, and moved to the next slide. Vianney looked down at her own tablet. In a minimized window at the bottom of her screen was the internal company messenger. Allmore's status bubble was green. Across the city, in the dim, yellow-walled confines of room 412, Allmore sat in the vinyl recliner. The laptop Vianney's IT department had couriered to him yesterday, balanced precariously on his knees. The sensory dissonance of his current reality was nauseating. His screen displayed a complex matrix of shipping manifests and customs declarations, a grid of raw capitalist data. But just over the top of the monitor, his reality was anchored by the steady mechanical hiss of a volumetric infusion pump delivering saline into his daughter's arm. Lily was asleep, her breathing shallow, but even. The heavy chemical scent of her medications masked the faint smell of the generic antibacterial soap Allmore had used to wash his face in the tiny ensuite bathroom. His eyes burned. He had slept for perhaps 3 hours, folded into a shape the human spine was not meant to hold. He typed an email to a vendor in Chicago with his right hand. His left hand rested on the bed rail, his index finger lightly tracing the knobby bone of Lily's wrist, just feeling the slow, thready pulse beneath her papery skin. A notification pinged softly on his screen. It was an automated alert. Routing approval, 44A overdue. Allmore cursed silently, his heart giving a weak, exhausted flutter of panic. He clicked the window frantically, trying to review the bill of lading. His brain felt like it was packed with wet cotton. The numbers blurred together. He was failing. He was drowning in the exact way Gregory had predicted. Before he could hit approve, another notification popped up. Approval 44-A, cleared by J. Miller Jr. analyst. Allmore stopped typing. He stared at the screen. A moment later, a direct message appeared from Vianney Nelson's encrypted administrative account. It wasn't a warm, supportive check-in. It was starkly pragmatic. Nelson V. Miller is monitoring your overflow. Do not prioritize the Chicago vendors today. Focus on the internal audit files. They do not require immediate turnaround. Allmore let out a long, shaky breath, the air whistling through his teeth. He didn't type back a profound thank you. That wasn't their dynamic. The transaction they had made in the cafeteria was built on a fragile, unspoken understanding that neither of them knew how to handle the emotional weight of what had happened. He simply typed, received, moving to audit files. He closed the chat, leaned his head back against the hard plastic of the recliner, and closed his eyes, letting the rhythmic hiss of the IV pump anchor him to the room. He was still in hell. But for the first time in 6 months, he wasn't navigating it entirely alone. October brought a bitter, damp chill to the city, turning the sky the color of a bruised plum. Vianney's Maybach idled at the curb outside the main entrance of St. Jude's. She sat in the back seat, a thick wool trench coat draped over her shoulders. Beside her on the leather seat was a sleek, matte black cardboard box containing a high-end tablet and a noise-cancelling headset. It had been 5 weeks since the cafeteria. She told herself the visit was strictly operational. Allmore had mentioned in a brief logistical email that his current headset was picking up the background noise of the hospital during conference calls. A CEO delivering IT equipment was absurd, but Vianney found herself clutching the excuse like a lifeline. The truth, buried under layers of corporate rationalization, was that the unresolved tension of their last meeting still chafed at her. She walked through the lobby. It still smelled of floor cleaner and stale despair, but the visceral shock of the environment had dulled. She navigated the elevators and the yellow corridors with a grim familiarity, stopping outside room 412. The door was wide open. Vianney paused in the doorway. The room was different. The harsh overhead lights were off, replaced by the soft, warm glow of a small desk lamp Almore had brought from home. Almore was not in the recliner. He was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed. And Lily was awake. She was sitting up, propped against a mountain of starchy hospital pillows. She looked incredibly fragile, her collarbones sharp against the neckline of her cotton gown, but her eyes were alert. They were dark and wide, tracking the movements of a cartoon playing on a tablet resting on Almore's lap. Almore was holding a small plastic cup of crushed ice, feeding her tiny spoonfuls. He looked terrible. His hair was getting long, curling aggressively at the nape of his neck, and his face was etched with permanent lines of fatigue. But the terrifying, hollow desperation was gone. He looked like a man fighting a war, rather than a man who had already surrendered. Vianney stood frozen, suddenly acutely aware of how much space she took up. Her heels, her coat, her sheer presence felt entirely intrusive. She took a half-step backward, intending to leave the box at the nurse's station. "Miss Nelson." Almore's voice was quiet, raspy, but it lacked the defensive edge it had wielded weeks ago. He had spotted her in his peripheral vision. Vianney stopped. She stepped into the room, holding the black box rigidly in front of her. "Almore, I apologize for interrupting. I can leave this at the desk." Lily turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto Vianney. The child didn't look scared. She looked mildly curious, the way children view a strange bird that lands on their windowsill. "Who is that?" Lily asked. Her voice was tiny, breathy, like the sound of dry leaves scraping across pavement. Almore gently placed the spoon into the ice cup. "That's my boss bug, Ms. Nelson." Lily stared at Vianney's immaculate trench coat and the severe, sharp cut of her bob. "She looks like a villain from my movie," Lily stated matter-of-factly. Almore stiffened his eyes, darting to Vianney in a moment of pure, panicked mortification. He opened his mouth to apologize, to scold his daughter, but the sound died in his throat. Vianney froze. For a terrifying second, the old, hardened CEO reflex flared the urge to correct, to intimidate, to assert authority. But she looked at the bald, sick 7-year-old girl clutching a faded stuffed rabbit, and the ice cracked. A sudden sharp sound escaped Vianney's lips. It was a laugh. It was a rusty, awkward sound, unpracticed and abrupt, but it was genuine. She stepped closer to the bed, offering a tight, imperfect smile that felt completely foreign on her face. "Your assessment is highly accurate," Lily Faith Vianney said, her tone dry, but lacking its usual venom. "I do wear a lot of black, and I am generally quite demanding." Lily blinked a tiny, tired smile, tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Do you have a secret lair?" "I have a corner office on the 41st floor," Vianney replied, setting the IT box down on the small rolling table. "It serves the same purpose." She turned to Almore. The panic had drained from his face, replaced by a quiet, baffled astonishment. He had never seen Vianney Nelson act like a human being. "The headset," Vianney said, pointing to the box, immediately retreating into the safety of logistics. "The noise-cancelling algorithm on your current model is inadequate for client calls. This one is military grade. It should block out the monitors." Almore looked at the expensive box, then back at Vianney. The heavy, unsaid things hung in the air between them, the debt, the firing, the cafeteria. But here, in the quiet glow of the desk lamp, those things felt less like a chasm and more like a bridge. They had both survived crossing. "Thank you," Almore said softly. He didn't mean just the headset. The weight behind the two words was immense, pulling double duty for everything he hadn't been able to say when he was weeping over a sticky laminate table. Vianney gave a stiff, jerky nod. "Your Q3 reports were adequate. Ensure Miller sends me the final audit by Friday." "I'll have it to you by Thursday," Almore replied, a faint, exhausted smirk touching his lips. Don't overpromise, Almore. It's a bad habit. Vianney turned on her heel and walked out of the room. She didn't look back. She strode down the yellow corridor, her heels clicking a steady, grounded rhythm on the linoleum. The cold weight that had sat in her stomach for weeks hadn't entirely vanished. Lily was still sick. Almore was still trapped in a nightmare. Money hadn't cured the reality of human suffering. But as she stepped into the elevator and the doors slid shut, Vianney realized the suffocating numbness of her optimized life had cracked open. She was no longer just a spectator watching variables on a spreadsheet. She was in the messy, chaotic, inefficient world of the living. And for the first time in her life, she had no desire to calculate her way out of it. Did Vianney's raw realization change the way you view the invisible struggles of the people around you? Corporate efficiency often blinds us to profound human realities, but it only takes one moment to shatter the glass and step into the messy truth of empathy. If this story struck a chord with you, please drop a like, share it with someone who needs a reminder of our shared humanity, and hit subscribe for more deeply grounded, emotional storytelling. Don't forget to comment below with your thoughts on Vianney's ultimate choice.